Welcome. We begin this evening by acknowledging that we gather on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples, land that has never been ceded, that was, is and will be the land of First Peoples. In coming to the Bastow Institute tonight, we also mark the 150th anniversary of the Act passed by the Victorian colonial government to provide free, secular and compulsory schooling. Once this act was passed, there was a school building frenzy overseen by Henry Bastow, whose memorial statue stands at the Queensbury Street entrance to this building. So tonight we call to mind that history. Now to the business of this evening. It is our pleasure to welcome Professor Miles Lewis, who will present us with some of his detailed research and understanding of the production and use of paints in the exteriors and interiors of Victorian buildings. There is much to know and we are looking forward to it. Thank you, Miles.
Good evening all. I'd ask you if you have quick questions or comments to chip in as I go. Don't be shy. It's much easier than waiting till the end and going back and finding the relevant slide. What I want to do first of all is to give you an indication of where we're going by going through these rough headings. The first thing I need to remind you from a 21st century point of view is that paints were generally not made in a factory and not made in a paint shop. They were made on site, mixed on site, and that means there are no colour cards. Although there were recipes that said you can make a purple by this mixture, you don't have any sure guide to the exact colours being used from any documentary source. Textbooks very rarely publish paint colours, and if they do, they're not going to be accurate. I'm trying to bring out to you the difficulty of researching this topic in any accurate fashion. And the same applies to the physical investigation of colours, which I'll come back to later on. There's all sorts of traps and difficulties in interpreting what you find on site. Now, colours were mostly based on natural earths and minerals, things like ochres and umbers and so on. I'll come back to that also in some detail. They tended, at least the external colours, to be, by our standards, slightly dull. Also, there are real differences in cost between colours. So when you're doing a scheme for a building, whether you decide to use crimson or not is a major economic factor. It's not like today when paints are more or less homogeneous, you choose whatever colour you like out of the book. Likewise, there are real differences in durability. Some colours were fugitive, that is, they faded in the light, or they changed colour because of pollution. So again, you couldn't just choose colours at random, you had to give consideration to all these factors. There were conventions, not written down, but more or less understood as to what sort of colours you used on what part of a building. And in the same way, when I get to discussing signs, there were conventions as to where sign writing would go on a building. And those conventions are the basis for the National Trust bulletins on those subjects. I want to begin by looking at ruled stucco, which is something we tend to forget about, very common in early Australian buildings. The reason is that when there's stucco being either cement or a lime finish on what is usually a brick building, the aim is always to imitate stone. It's always to imitate the classiest freestone you can get. And so ruled stucco is very commonly used, although it doesn't survive often today. It's ruled to look like stone blocks. And I want to show you a few examples of that, showing ashlar masonry. This is the first example. This is Old Government House, Parramatta, New South Wales. And here, because it was originally a single room deep, and they doubled the depth of it, where the two structures join, the old wall is preserved inside a cupboard. That's what you're seeing there. Ignore the brown stripes, that's something that's been adhering to it, and you can see the wall behind in a rather beautiful cream-coloured finish with the lines of the ashlar blocks ruled, probably in this case in crayon. A soft lead pencil or crayon was used, or a groove was struck in the surface with a trowel. Sometimes other colours are used, as we'll see. Here's another early example from the Anglesey Barracks in Hobart. Similar treatment. In this case, there is a groove as well as the colour. You see at the very top where the paint is still on, you can see the groove through the paint. This one, another Tasmanian one. Now here at Mountford, where the paint's peeled off, you can see the original stone colour. Of course, it's hard to interpret these things. There will be discoloration because of pollution and so on, but you're seeing an actual tinted cement finish under that painted surface. And here's a rare example in Victoria. Pontville, Doncaster, was a house with a big veranda around it. Later on, rooms were built into the veranda. And when those rooms were taken out again, you can see above the ceiling line, the old finish. So in that large picture, you're seeing the timber at the bottom as the framework for the ceiling. You're looking above that to the wall of the house, and you can see the same ruled ashlar finish. And this one again in Tasmania, the difference why I'm showing this one is that the grooves are now coloured in white or off-white rather than black. That's the sort of variation you get in these finishes. Now here's a much later example in Victoria at Port Fairy. And once again, the painters, modern painters come off, and you're seeing there the crown lines of the ashlar finish and some of the original coloration of the stucco. Now often you'll find in painted houses, you can still see those grooves, although they're not sort of featured in the same way. This is an example of Bendigo. It's been painted, but it's an early example of probably a hydraulic cement stucco, and the ruled grooves are clearly visible in through the paintwork.
What do you mean hydraulic?
A hydraulic lime is one that will resist water. So if you use common lime, ordinary common lime on the wall, it'll wash off. Hydraulic lime is burnt to a higher temperature. It has water resistant properties, so it will stay on the surface. I want to turn now to some examples of interior surfaces. First of all, very often interiors were left unfinished for some time. Plaster finishes were left to dry out, maybe for a year or 2 years before the decoration went on. It can be very deceptive looking at these seams of decoration to know which is the intended original finish, which might have been a temporary finish. This is a rather odd example here. If you look closely at that ceiling, and this is the Villa Arbor in Kew, wonderful 1880s house in Kew, there's a pattern visible through that white panel. That's not part of the scheme of decoration we're looking at. It's part of the scheme of decoration which preceded it. And the lines have leached through the paint at some later date. Apparently they were carried out in some sort of glue size, a very sketchy temporary scheme before they put the final scheme on. Where the arrows are, you're seeing there's a line of what was meant to be rope with tassels hanging out leftwards. So there's rather strange rope surrounding in the ceiling, which you can just see through the later off-white paint. I also need to mention these materials. Keynes and Martin cements are not actually cement, they're plasters, they're hard plasters, and they're very much used in interior finishes. Here, example, the Queen's Hall of the Public Library, and now the State Library of Melbourne, which is finished in one of these cements, meant to look like marble. That's one thing they did with these cements, get this marble finish. And it was a terrible failure. You can see looking at it that there are marks down the columns, and they had to in the end be painted. The marks partly perhaps reflect some sort of pollution or dampness, but in particular, they're showing where the plasterer's work stopped one day and started again, because you can see he's done the hard bits around the bottom of the column, which is very dark at the front column, and the hard bits around with the junction of the mezzanine floor, leaving till a later stage to fill out all the easy grooves in between. And unfortunately, that change in the work has registered now in that change of colour. One of the best examples of the use of these cements is the National Trust House, Barwon Park at Winchelsea, because that was finished entirely internally in Keynes cement. Keynes cement came commercially in both a pink and a white. Both could be used to create an imitation marble finish. In this house, although this has been partly repainted, the scheme you're seeing is the scheme that was used at the time. So they did the whole thing interior in pink and white Keynes cement. It's used not just for decoration and to imitate marble, it's used also for hard edges, for example, skirtings, which are going to be scuffed and maybe chipped. It's harder than timber. Often you've a good quality house, you look at a skirting you think is timber, you look closer, you find it's one of these hard plaster finishes. It's a detail of that decoration at Barwon Park. Now turning to some of the main types of paint. The typical paint is made of linseed oil as the vehicle, white lead, which provides the body and obscures the substrate, the colour and so on of the substrate on which it's painted, and the pigment which gives it the required colour. And the other things, especially turpentine and dyes, may be added. There are many, many variant recipes. And these are the pigments which are in use. Now, I don't expect you to go through and read all these, but to give you some idea of what was available, it includes, as I said, natural earth finishes like ochres and umbers, and other mineral finishes, white lead and red lead, for example. It includes a few organic materials like indigo, includes copper compounds, verdigris or Florentine bronze is one of the verdigris type paints. And as I said, paints were not homogeneous. They were not uniform. They all had different properties. Blues tended to fade, so you couldn't use them on the outside of a building. Prussian blue and indigo would fade. On the other hand, cobalt blue, which is a mineral, survives on the exterior. So you tend to be limited in exterior blue colours to cobalt blue. Others, like Brunswick green and verdigris, as I said, changed colour. They turned black in a polluted atmosphere. Vermilion and crimson lake couldn't be mixed in the normal way with linseed oil. They would fade and settle out. They had to be mixed with varnish instead. So the painter's craft is a really specialised one in dealing with all these problems, quite unlike today. Now, these are the colours you won't normally find in house paints, and you may wonder why, because these are some of the best colours which became available during the Victorian period, the aniline dyes. The original aniline dyes came from indigo. The indigo plant gave you indigo colour, the blue colour. It was then found you could create other colours using the indigo plant. And then they discovered the same dyes, anil just means indigo, but the same indigo dyes, in fact, could be found in coal tar. Much cheaper to use coal tar to produce the same colours. So these here are all coal tar colours, but they're dyes and they're not suitable for pigments in paint. So that's why you get much brighter colours in some other products than in house paints. So these colours are used to some extent in internal fresco work, in, say, the light powdery calcimine sort of finishes, calcimine type finishes, which give you clear pastel colours, but not very strong ones. And they can take some of these aniline dyes. Turning to some aspects of exterior painting, one of the most common mineral-based paints is ferric oxide, which is used for ironwork, for sometimes on early cast iron decoration, for iron roofs and so on. And it's one of the cheapest and most durable of these colours. It's also used, surprisingly, not just for ironwork, but on brickwork for particular reasons, where you have tuck pointing. Now, you may be familiar with tuck pointing, where the brickwork is picked out in these little white lines. I'll just show you, like that. For some reason, I've got a South African example, which is all I had to hand, but that's what it is. So you obscure the irregular, thick joints of your brickwork by making the mortar red, so you don't see it, and then cutting a groove into it and running lime putty into it to create those sharp white lines. And the colouring used in the mortar of the joint is the same Indian red colour. And often it leaches down the face of the building. Water brings it out and it washes down the face of the building. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether that's been done on purpose, because it is done on purpose at times, but doesn't really matter. It does appear on the face of commonly of tuck-pointed brick structures, like that one. Really, as I said, you get textbook illustrations of colours, but this is one example published in America, but would apply largely to Australia. And this makes the point I was making before. The aim has always been to imitate freestones, Bath stone, Cong stone, and so on, fashionable in Britain especially. So there's very limited range, limited by that aspiration to imitate stone, and limited by the sorts of durable pigments and colours which are available for use. So it seems, to our eyes, a very restricted range. Although the rationale is that this is to apply to stuccos to give that stone effect. It's also used, both in America and here, on boarding as well, on clapboard, weatherboard houses, rather than have a completely different system for that purpose. Later on, you get other colourants like this one that appears to be up there in the parapet where the arrow is, copperas. Now, copperas, despite its name sounding like copper, is in fact ferrous sulfate. It's another iron-based dye, very commonly used in the late 19th century. Not so much a paint, but a wash you apply to the finish of cement, or sometimes mixed into the cement to give it a slightly less grey, dull colour and bring out that sort of orange character. You can see why it's preserved there. It's preserved because all above the parapet, on the parapet's been washed off, but where the projection is, it's kept the water off it, so it's stayed more or less in place. Then you get much more complicated schemes. Now here you're probably seeing more than one type of cement. These are the two main public buildings at Bendigo, the law courts and the post office. Often the more fine mouldings like those of the arch are run in a whiter cement, like cement fondue, and a more common cement is used for the body of the work. But also here, there would have been colours applied, washed colours applied. And then later in that panel on the right, there's a bit of paint being applied to finish that panel. And I couldn't tell you which bit of each this is. I mean, it's a complicated arrangement. Now, as I said, you don't normally get paint colour cards in Australia, but you do fairly on in the United States, fairly early on in the United States. And although they're not being used here at this stage, they give an indication of the sorts of colours that might be used in the absence of any other objective information. So you're seeing a similar range, slightly bigger range of still rather dull colours, which would be normal, especially on a stucco building. I might just mention though, at the left, you see that row of 3 on the left, which got sand in them. I'll come back to that topic later on, but the idea of a sand finish, first of all, it can be done 2 ways. One is you would paint glue on the face of the building and then throw sand at it, and that would give a rather convincing stone effect. Or in this case, you mix the sand into the paint, which is what they're showing here, because you could buy this paint pre-mixed with the sand in it. And here now, you're getting the Harrison brothers a more elaborate colour card, 1871, again, way ahead of what you have in Australia. And there you see a brighter range of colours. Probably the darker and richer colours would be used on timber rather than on the stucco wall. You have to bear in mind that in the United States, you get quite elaborate 2-storey timber houses. And the tendency for, especially the trim, for the decorative part of the timber, is to use richer and brighter colours. And that applies here where it's relevant at all. Here's one of the first directed to the Australian market. And you see it showing 2 rather boring colours. But it's the earliest example I have, which is pre-mixed paints are being advertised for use in Australia. Now, 1885, we're going on a little bit further, even greater range of colours. This is one of 2 colour cards of the F.W. DeVoe company. And they were good marketers. And for example, they show examples of buildings in different colour schemes. So the purchaser could visualise the use of combinations of colours in this way. And then finally, this is the first English example I know of, Carson's, which are possibly slightly brighter than the American ones, but very late in date. This is in the 1890s. Now, turning to examples in Australia, they can be deceptive, but let me make one point about this, which is quite clear. There's a hierarchy of materials. Stone was always the preferred material, and that's why you tried to imitate stone colours when you were painting the outside of a house. Bluestone generally was not painted. It was a stone, not all that much light. It was seen to be dull, but nevertheless, generally speaking, it was not painted. Above the bluestone, though, you've got a cement finish, a stucco finish, which was painted, but not in these colours. You can see that under those colours, there are ruled lines. It was, in fact, in the same ruled stucco treatment I've discussed before. The paints which have been put on later, though, are still 19th century type colours, ochre, umber type colours. So it does give you quite a good idea of what you might find in the late 19th century. And this one makes another point. Again, this is in Fitzroy, glass terrace. Before it was totally repainted, on the right, you've got one of the window architraves, and the paints come off, and you can see the original colours there. So you can make out what was used to give that slightly browner effect than the body of the building around the windows. Again, with some discoloration due to dirt and wear over time. And that brings me to the topic of polychromy, multicolours work, which is rare and rather special. It occurs in various places. One which people forget about is tombstones, because they nearly all have been eroded. But that tombstone clearly had originally quite a strong range of colour in the carving. And in houses, this scheme here, which is Parliament Place, wrongly called Tasman Terrace by the National Trust, has 4 different paint colours. Originally, it would have had the stucco finish, which hasn't been properly examined, so we don't really know about it. It had striped roofs on the balconies, which again were destroyed before we could investigate it. But this was the first building in Australia I know of where we investigated the colours of the paint on the other parts of the building, on the veranda. Actually investigated and used Munsell values to assess them. There are actually 4 colours there, which may seem complicated, and it's hard to make them out. But there's a consistency. There are 2 colours used on all the timber elements, and another 2 colours used on the iron elements. So again, they don't mix them up. They have a sort of principle underlying it. The strong green colour is a Florentine bronze. It's one of those copper-based colours I referred to before. And then in shops, you might have much more elaborate schemes. This one here includes gilding, artificial marbling. The 2 pilasters down either side of the facade are artificial marble. It can include in these facades sections of mirror. So very elaborate systems. And that brings me to the topic of sign writing. Here's an interesting example which turned up fairly recent times when the paint was stripped off. This is Royal Terrace, not the Royal Terrace we all know in Nicholson Street, Fitzroy, but the second Royal Terrace in Brunswick Street, Fitzroy. And the corner building was occupied by a doctor. And when it was stripped, the paint was stripped off, you can see the original sign writing. He did vaccinations, COVID apparently, maybe flu as well, I don't know. He extracted teeth and he prepared prescriptions. And when you go around the side of the building, you see he also dealt with sheep and cattle, which is something modern doctors tend not to do. You might just note that the lettering is very nice. So we go back to the first one, perhaps. Look at the wonderful ampersand sign on the middle piece under the teeth extracted. Beautiful sign writing. And that brings me to the faces which are used. Now, this is from the National Trust Bulletin on Sign Writing, which was prepared by my colleague, the late George Tibbets. And unfortunately, doesn't seem to be used as much as the paint colour controls. It's a very valuable document, but seems to have been largely forgotten, which is a shame. But here he's shown a number of the colours he found, in this case in Beechworth, a number of the sign faces he found, lettering faces he found in Beechworth with their names. And here are some of the less common ones, but often fancier ones. Now, the problem you find in towns like Beechworth and Malden is everybody who comes in and opens an antique shop wants to use a Gothic face. But in fact, in the original town, almost always, the only Gothic lettering was on the newspaper office. So you have to somehow stop people making all the signs of the town in Gothic, which would give you a very misleading impression. And I'll come back to that problem a little later. And when you, in fact, survey the sign writing, you see that, in fact, nearly all of it is sans serif. All those other things are used very rarely. Sans serif is the plain lettering without any little points, the serifs on the letters. And that's why you have to try and keep a conservative approach to sign writing in these towns. But by the turn of the century, suddenly all that sort of goes. Here's a building in Collingwood, in Collingwood, where the whole facade has now been taken over with signage, not kept to any appropriate spot, no moderation being shown here. And another thing which you may not be aware of is you often find still around the inner suburbs these fences around the top of the shop veranda. And if you gave it any thought, you probably thought it was something to do with the health and safety regulations, but it's not. That fence is designed for attaching signage to it. Not so much, as you see there, that fence there with a sort of permanent sign on, but more particularly where you have a fabric sign which you stick up for a sale. So you have your summer sale and you unroll your bit of calico with the painting on it, stick it on your fence, and after the sale you roll it up and put it away for next year and put another sign on. And that's what those fences are for. There's a detail of that one in Fitzroy. Sorry? I don't think so. I think it went just a few years ago. This was taken, I don't know, about 6 years ago, so I think it may have gone since then.
I think it's still here.
Is it still there, is it?
Yeah, and it's still the furniture store sign as well.
Yeah, the Johnson sign, yeah. Johnson's furniture store, which relation to my wife, yeah, yes. And so this brings us to the topic of how you control sign writing. In this bulletin by George Tibbets, he's suggested the areas where sign writing goes, essentially on the places on the building which are designed to have signs on them. That means you don't have signs hanging below the veranda or stuck on top of the veranda. You have them on the end spandrel, the triangular end of the veranda perhaps, on the front of the veranda if it's wide enough, and so on. You can see very clearly where these signs all go. And they're laid out, this is from actual examples, nearly all are symmetrical. And so this tends to be required in signs which are painted in these areas. You don't allow for any trade liveries like you see at the bottom here, Coca-Cola. You just say, too bad. You can't have the cafe owner will come in and say, I'm selling Coca-Cola, I've got to have the Coca-Cola sign. You mustn't let it happen because it'll totally destroy the effect of your building. And colour controls are rather on the same basis. That is, you have to be conservative where you don't know the detailed facts. And I want to clearly distinguish, in restoring an important building, you should investigate it fully, both in documentary and physical terms, and restore the actual colour scheme as best you can. But in a conservation area, that's not going to be practical for all the buildings. So you adopt these conservative guidelines to stop everything going haywire across the conservation area. Now, the problems are that, as I said before, the available illustrations you have from the 19th century are only the most general guides because accurate colour reproduction was not used. Individual investigations which have been done by, say, conservation architects tend to be much biased towards important houses and public buildings, so you get a sort of impression of what the colours were in normal use. And as I said before, most painters, certainly in Australia, mixed their own colours, and ready mixed paints were not in general use. There are some exceptions which I'll come to if I have time a little later on. And as I said, the commonest and cheapest colours are based upon the cheapest sort of natural earths and minerals and so on. Now, this is the general picture. As I said before, stucco or cemented walls invariably aim for a light stone colour. There's almost no exception to that. Timber and iron are more richly coloured. In fact, one rather surprising thing is to advertise a yellow roofing paint. Now, if you're controlling the conservation area, the last thing you want is every person in the town painting their roof yellow. On the other hand, if the person can show that their roof was yellow, of course, you're allowed to be done. That's the principle underlying these controls. Generally speaking, they're consistent in a building. So all the iron is one colour, all the timber another, or maybe two, as we saw in the case of the National Trust building, Parliament Place. Veranda roofs were sometimes plain, but often they were striped, and you'll see it in old photographs, and that striping imitates the striping of canvas and oilcloth verandas in the Regency style in Britain, which survives as a convention right through the 19th into the early 20th century. Much gayer sort of treatment. But the main roof of a building is very rarely painted.